Let's continue the conversation with civil rights and criminal defense attorney Jamie White. He's been involved in Michigan state legislature's efforts to reform state laws around statutes and other legislative issues. Thank you so much for joining us on The Why, Jamie. We know there's a complicated relationship between the Office of the President and agencies like the Department of Justice and the FBI. Do you think this indictment exacerbates Americans' distrust in our federal agencies?
For some Americans, it certainly does. I would just push back a little bit. I think the relationship between the Department of Justice and the White House has not been complicated for many presidents. President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton did not have these sorts of conflicts, issues that were put in front of them. I think that at the end of the day, the Department of Justice has been put into a position where they have two choices: enforce the law or look the other way. And Jack Smith has decided to enforce the law.
There's no formal boundary between the Office of the President and the DOJ, as we learned in our reporting. Despite his rhetoric now, former President Trump would call on the DOJ to conduct investigations on political opponents, namely, Hillary Clinton, the DNC. Does all this kind of prove the system's ambiguity is flawed? Do you think it's a fair assessment to say the ambiguity isn't helping here?
I do think there's some policy considerations that need to come into play as we move forward beyond this case and potentially even during this case. President Trump has exposed some blind spots, so to speak. This case in particular has exposed some blind spots. When you poll the majority of America today, 40% of the people say that they believe that the department is weaponized. I don't believe that to be true, but the fact that so many Americans find that to be a truth is troubling, and I do think that we're going to have to address it, with statutes and policy changes.
Yeah, I want to call back to Jack Smith because you mentioned him. Folks at home, Mr. Trump called special counsel Jack Smith, quote, deranged during a speech in Bedminster, New Jersey. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland then said Smith has a commitment to the law. Can you help us understand how is someone vetted and appointed as special counsel? Just insight to the process.
Well, the basis is experience, and Jack Smith has an extraordinary amount of experience. And ultimately, you want to have somebody who is going to be objective and not have political aspirations or any sort of political swing. And there's nothing involving Jack Smith's career that suggests this is the case. We saw this to some degree with the late Ken Starr and the Clinton administration investigation, and there certainly have been other prosecutors who, at least on their face, have been accused credibly of being politically persuaded. But there's nothing involving Mr. Smith. His career speaks to objectivity and aggressiveness, and that's what he's doing here. And I think that if this was a Democratic president, we'd be in the same position that we are now.
We've got 30 seconds here, and you mentioned this. Public opinion on really several departments, FBI, Homeland Security, Supreme Court, have arguably become polarized. Who fixes this and how?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's going to be up to the moderates. We're hearing a lot of rhetoric, from one side of the aisle in particular, making all kinds of accusations against law enforcement and the Department of Justice. But I think that when we dive a little deeper, there is a significant moderate middle on both sides of the aisle that recognize this is a real problem, and fairness to democracy cannot go on unchecked.
Civil rights and criminal defense attorney Jamie White, thank you so much for your insight. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.